So if you've clicked on this video, then I'm assuming that you use Lightroom to edit your photos, or maybe you're just looking to get into using Lightroom for editing photos. So today we're gonna give you 5 really useful Lightroom tricks for photo editing that you need to know. Hi everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel. We are magazines, photographers, filmmakers, couple.
Sure are.
All that good stuff. So let's not waste any more time. You're here for Lightroom tips. Let's start with tip number 1. So tip number 1 is all about adding a little bit of extra sharpness to your photos. And Chris is going to show you how to do it. Go Chris! Woohoo!
Okay, so sharpening is a pretty important part of editing your photo, and there's a quick little way that you can do it in Lightroom. So here is the quickest way to make sure that the parts of your image that are in focus are sharpened a little bit extra. So come down here to the sharpening tab in Lightroom and put your sharpening at about 40 or 50 is normally where we go. And then we can simply drag this little slider here that says masking. What you can do is hold the Alt key or the Option key if you're on a Mac and just drag to the right. And this little screen will appear, and you want to make sure that whatever it is that's in focus in your image, or whatever the subject is the part that's white. The rest can be pretty much black. So if we keep dragging to the right, we will see that now only the little action camera and a little bit of the rock around it is being sharpened, and that's what you want. And in and around there looks pretty good, and that means that we're only sharpening the part of the image that's actually in focus, the actual subject, and not everything else, because it doesn't need to be sharpened.
So tip number 2 is, for the purpose of this video, we've called it the power of Alt. Or if you're using a Mac, this button would be the Option key. This can be used for a few different things, so Chris is going to show you exactly what. I'm a fat man!
Okay, so the Alt or the Option key can be used in a few different ways, and I'm going to show you right now the best ways you can probably use it to make sure your image is exposed right. So let's go down to this photo, and you can use it in, or at least we use it from time to time, in the highlights, shadows, whites and the blacks, mainly just the whites and the blacks. But for the highlights, you can just make sure you hold the Alt or the Option key when you're dragging your slider, and the screen will normally appear completely black at the start. But if you drag the whole way to the right, you will start to see that little white patches appear on the screen. That means that you're almost peaking the highlights, and you don't want to get that far. But you can check it that way, and you can do the same with the shadows. And if you drag it all the way to the left, on this image it doesn't show it, but normally that would light up kind of blue, and you would see the parts of the image that are way too dark. If we go to the whites, you can do the same thing and drag to the right, and you'll start to see the whites come in. That means when you get to this point, it's way too white, and that part of the image is going to be completely blown out, as you can see. So you want to kind of, if you want there to be bright whites in your photo, then drag till just before you see those colors and then stop. And then the same with the blacks, drag down, and you start to see the part of the image where it's too dark come in. Just let it go just before that, and you'll end up with almost complete whites or almost complete blacks, depending on what you want. We don't normally edit with like bright images like that, so it's not normally our style, but you can figure out exactly where the darkest parts are, and if they're too dark, or if the brightest parts are too bright. So yeah, use that little technique to expose your image how you want to in your next photo.
So the next tip is one of Lightroom's latest additions, and it is the color grading tool.
Okay, so yeah, like Christina said, the color grading tool in Lightroom is a pretty new addition. It's only been in the past month or so, I believe, and it's quite cool. So you can affect the midtones, the shadows, and the highlights of your image, and you can add whatever color tone you kind of want to them, so you can have like a split tone effect on your photo. The previous version on Lightroom only allowed you to do the highlights and the shadows, but now you can do the midtones, and you can just vary things up a little bit. So here's an example photo that I'm going to use, and this photo is generally pretty warm. That's how we like our photos to look. The highlights are pretty warm, obviously, because it's sunset, but the midtones and the shadows are also pretty warm. That's just the style we like. But if you do like that kind of teal and orange vibe, what you can do is come down here to the shadows circle and drag this little circle down more into the blues, and you can see now that the buildings, which are the shadowy part of the image, are now starting to get that like teal look to them. and it looks pretty cool too. Not our style, but I know a lot of people do like that teal and orange look. You could also go kind of strange with it and make it green looking, or really whatever color you want that will place that color into the shadows of the image more. And then with the two little sliders at the bottom, the first one being blending, it's pretty much used to blend that color together with like the lower parts of the midtone, so you don't get a real drastic difference from the shadows, like the blue part, real drastic drop off. So normally if we're changing this, we keep it at 100 so it blends nicely. And then the balance is simply how much this affects, how much it drifts into the highlights or how much of the shadows it affects. And that's entirely up to you. If you drag it to the left, it'll affect a little bit less of the shadows, the darker parts of the shadows. If you drag it to the right, it will affect more of it, if that makes sense. But yeah, I'll not ramble on too much. You can then do the same thing to the highlights. You could make the highlights warmer, or you could make them a little bit colder looking, and the same with the midtones. And you can kind of completely change how a photo looks by doing this. And yeah, just play around with it and see what you like.
So tip number 4 uses the graduated filter. Now if you've used Lightroom before, you probably know what the graduated filter is, but this little tip is something that you can use inside it that you might not have known about. I forgot to finish that sentence.
Interesting. Okay, so the graduated filter is something that we use pretty much in all photos if the sky is quite bright, and the way we use it is like this. So let's take this image, which was just at sunset clearly, and the sun is very bright. If you want it to just bring down the brightness of the sun so that there's a bit more color in the sky, this is how you can do it. So take the graduated tool, drag down over the top of the sky, and you can hit the O button just to see what exactly it's selecting, and then come down here to the mask section and click on, and then if we click luminance, we can choose what parts of the sky that's selecting. So if we just leave it the way it is now, it's going to select everything right down to the trees, and if we bring the highlights down, it'll bring down any of the highlights, even like the little highlight bits glinting off the trees or whatever it is. And this way we can adjust this, and you can see that the red is now moving away from the slightly darker parts and just towards the center part, which is the sun, which is more what you would want to bring down. So let's go for that. Yeah, we can see now, my bad, it wasn't on screen. We can see now what it's affecting, what it isn't. So it's affecting almost everything there, and if we drag it up, it slowly moves in towards the sun, which is the brightest part. And if I leave it there and bring the highlights down, we can see that now there is more color in the sky, and the area around the sun is not as bright as it was. If we drag the highlights the whole way up, the sky is pretty much white. So it's just a way of adjusting the brightest parts of the sky and making sure that you're not bringing down like clouds, for example, because if you bring the highlights way down in the clouds, you end up with a really dull kind of grey sky, and if that's not what you're going for, then it can be quite annoying. So use the luminance mask in your gradient, your graduated filters, to adjust just the brightest parts. And you can also do it for color. I don't have a good example of that, but you, instead of selecting like the highlights or the brightest parts, you can select a certain color with the graduated filter and just adjust that whatever way you want. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
So the last tip is all about vignetting, and no, it's not just moving that vignette slider. This little tip actually allows you to be a little bit more precise.
Okay, so another thing that we do in pretty much all our photos, because we like that kind of moody look, is a lot of vignetting. So a lot of darkness around the edges or kind of behind and around this subject normally. So the way that most people will know how you do that is just come down to the vignette slide or the vignette section here, and you can just drag to the left, which makes a pretty drastic looking vignette. You can kind of feather it out a little bit, and most of the time it does look pretty damn good. But normally what we like to do to be a bit more specific and precise with a vignette is use the radial filter and just draw around the subject. So in this case, these leaves is what we want to draw even more attention to. You can move this around like this and select roughly around these leaves where you want the vignette to kind of come up to. Hit O to see exactly what it's selecting, and you can feather that even more if you want, which just fades in the vignette a little bit. I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger. And then if we just drag down on the highlights a little bit and down on the shadows, you can kind of create your own vignette exactly how you want to. You're just a little bit more limited with the vignette section, whereas doing it this way, you can control exactly how much there is. You can control even more how dark it is and just be more precise with it. So if those moody shots are something that you like to do, then maybe try this method instead of just dragging that vignette slider all the way to the left.
So there you have it, guys. 5 little Lightroom tricks that you can use to make your photo editing workflow a little better. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, we would really appreciate if you could give it a big thumbs up. It really helps the video, especially being a new channel like we are here. So yeah, hit that thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button too, so you can see more videos just like this. And of course, there are many more Lightroom tricks that we have come across in our experience of editing. We actually found it hard to narrow it down to just 5, so if you're interested in seeing a part 2, then leave a comment down below. That's it for this one, and as we always say, take it easy, don't be a stranger.
Check. The grills in my mouth double as a freeze. The grills in my mouth double as a freeze. The grills in my mouth.